Before I start the story, comment where you're listening from. I'm curious. Here's a quick trailer for the story. David thought he had finally found someone special. Emily was beautiful, kind, and understood him in a way no one else had. But as strange glitches and eerie behaviors began to surface, he uncovered a horrifying truth. She wasn't human. Before he could escape, the men who created her made sure he would never remember she existed. If you enjoy the story, please like the video and subscribe to my channel Nightmare Archives. David mornings followed the same pattern they had for almost 3 years now. He would rise at precisely 15 a.m., shower with military efficiency, dress in clothes he barely registered choosing, and by 7:30 find himself seated at the same corner table at Grounds for Thought, a small coffee shop 6 blocks from his condo. No one had assigned him this table. It had simply become his through the quiet democracy of habit. The barristers knew him by name, but had long since stopped trying to engage him in conversation beyond necessary pleasantries. They understood, as people sometimes did, that his silence wasn't rudeness but a shell, a necessary fortification. "Black coffee, 2 sugars," he would say, and Nami or Troy or whoever stood behind the counter would nod and prepare it without comment. Today was Tuesday, November 12th, 2040. The morning was gray and cold, rain streaking the windows of the coffee shop in crooked silver lines. David sat with his hands wrapped around his mug, staring into the void of dark liquid as if it might resolve into something meaningful. His gold wedding band, which he still wore, caught the light occasionally when he moved his fingers. 3 years. 3 years since Caroline had died, and sometimes it felt like yesterday. Other times it felt like a lifetime ago. Like a memory belonging to someone else entirely. He'd heard people say that grief gets easier with time. They were wrong. It didn't get easier. You just developed calluses around it. He was so absorbed in these familiar thoughts that he didn't immediately notice when someone took the table adjacent to his. It wasn't until he heard the soft thud of a book being set down that he looked up. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair that fell just past her shoulders. She wore a deep blue coat that she was in the process of removing, revealing a simple white blouse underneath. What struck David most was the focused intensity with which she opened her book. Real paper book, not the digital tablets most people use these days. The woman must have sensed his gaze because she glanced up suddenly, meeting his eyes. David looked away quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring, but not before he noticed her eyes. Striking amber, almost the color of honey when light hit them. He returned to his coffee, determined not to be the creepy wood-hour ogling women in coffee shops. But a moment later, he found himself stealing another glance. The book she was reading had a worn leather cover with no visible title. She turned a page, and he noticed her fingernails were unpainted, cut short and practical. "It's Bradbury," she said without looking up. "The October Country." David felt heat rise in his face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's okay," she smiled then, turning slightly to face him. Most people are curious when they see actual paper books. They're practically antiques now. Her voice had a slight melodic quality to it. Not quite an accent, but something distinctive in the cadence. David found himself smiling back, the expression feeling strange and stiff on his face, like a long, unused muscle being stretched. "I haven't read that one," he admitted. "Really? It's classic horror. Some of the best short stories ever written." She held the book up, displaying the faded cover. "This was my father's copy." David nodded, not knowing what else to say. The conversation should have ended there, but after a brief pause, she spoke again. "I'm Emily, by the way." "David," he responded automatically. "Nice to meet you, David." She took a sip from her mug, tea from the look of it. "Do you come here often?" "I just moved to the area and I'm trying to find good local spots." The question was so typical, so normal that David almost laughed. When was the last time he had a conversation this mundane, this human? "Almost every day," he said. "They make decent coffee and don't mind if you sit for hours." Emily nodded appreciatively. "That's good to know. I work from home, so I need escape hatches or I'll go stir crazy." "What do you do?" The question was out before David could stop himself. "I'm a freelance content editor," she said. "Mostly technical documentation, but occasionally creative projects too. Not very exciting, but it pays the bills. How about you?" "Architectural engineer. I design building support systems." David surprised himself by continuing. "Also not very exciting." Emily laughed, a sound both soft and clear. "I don't know, building staying upright seems pretty important to me." There was something about her that put him at ease. She was attractive, certainly, but it was more than that. She had a quality of attentiveness when she listened, as if she was actually processing what you said rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. "What brought you to Seattle?" David asked, realizing with a start that he was genuinely curious about the answer. Emily hesitated just for a moment. "A fresh start, I guess. My last relationship ended badly, and I needed a change of scenery." She shrugged lightly. Classic running away story. "Sometimes running away is the right thing to do," David said quietly. Their eyes met again, and this time David didn't look away. There was something in her expression, a recognition of shared pain, perhaps, that resonated with him. The moment stretched, then broke as Emily glanced at her watch. "I should get going. I have a deadline this afternoon." She gathered her book and slipped it into a leather messenger bag. It was nice meeting you, David." "Likewise," he said, meaning it. She stood, shouldering her bag, then paused. "I'll probably be back tomorrow, same time. Maybe we continue our discussion of not very exciting professions." David felt a smile tug at his lips. "I'd like that." After she left, he remained at his table longer than usual, finishing his cold coffee. For the first time in years, he felt a small spark of something he couldn't quite name. Interest, perhaps, or possibility. Emily was there the next day, sitting at the same table with her book. This time she noticed him first and waved as he approached with his coffee. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." David settled into his chair. "Did you meet your deadline?" Emily brightened, seemingly pleased that he'd remembered. "Just barely. My client is the picky type. Wants everything perfect but can't actually articulate what perfect means." "I know the type," David said, thinking of his own supervisor, Marcus. Their conversation flowed more easily than the day before, moving from work frustrations to books they'd read to a debate about whether Seattle's perpetual rain was depressing or comforting. Emily argued for comfort. "Rain creates boundaries," she explained. "It makes indoor spaces feel more secure, more intimate. There's a reason so many horror stories take place on sunny days. They're exposing." David considered this. "I never thought about it that way, but I think you're right." Emily smiled, pleased. "Horror is all about subverting expectations, making the familiar strange. You seem to know a lot about it." "I've always been fascinated by what scares people," she said. "Not jump scares or gore. That's cheap. Real fear comes from uncertainty, from not being able to trust your own perceptions." There was something in her tone, a passion that transformed her face. David found himself leaning forward, drawn in. Like when reality shifts just enough that you notice something's wrong, but can't put your finger on what. "Exactly," Emily's eyes widened. "That uncanny valley feeling." The conversation continued until David reluctantly checked his watch and realized he was going to be late for work. As he stood to leave, Emily looked up at him. "Maybe we could get dinner sometime," she suggested. "Continue this conversation somewhere with actual food." David hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that." They exchanged numbers, and David walked to his office with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in years. Their first official date was at a small Italian restaurant 3 days later. Emily wore a simple, black dress that complemented her figure without being showy. Her hair was loosely curled, framing her face in a way that softened her features. "You look beautiful," David said when she arrived, the words feeling unfamiliar on his tongue. "Thank you." She smiled, seeming genuinely pleased. "You clean up pretty well yourself." Over pasta and wine, their conversation deepened. Emily asked about his work, listening intently as he explained the challenges of retrofitting century-old buildings to meet modern safety standards. "I love old buildings," she said. "They have character that modern structures lack, like they've absorbed the emotions of everyone who's ever lived or worked in them." "That's a poetic way of looking at it," David replied. "Most people just see the hassle of outdated electrical systems and load-bearing walls in inconvenient places." Emily laughed. "I guess that's where you're not, so a boring job comes in." When she asked about his life outside work, David found himself telling her about Caroline. He hadn't planned to. Mentioning her on a first date seemed like an obvious misstep, but somehow it felt natural. "We were married for 12 years, he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Cancer took her. It was quick, at least. 3 months from diagnosis to the end." Emily reached across the table and touched his hand lightly. "I'm so sorry, David." Her response was perfect, sympathetic without being pitying. She didn't offer platitudes or change the subject awkwardly. She simply acknowledged his loss and let the moment breathe. When the check came, Emily insisted on splitting it. "Call me old-fashioned," she said with a smile that suggested she was anything but I believe in equality in all things." David agreed easily, appreciating her directness. Outside the restaurant, standing beneath the awning as rain pattered down around them, Emily looked up at him. "I had a wonderful time tonight." "So did I," David said, surprised by how true it was. She reached up and gently touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. "May I kiss you?" The question was so unexpected, so refreshingly straightforward, that David simply nodded. Emily rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that was gentle but not hesitant. David closed his eyes, losing himself in the sensation. When they pulled apart, Emily smiled. "Good night, David." He watched her walk away, umbrella twirling above her head, feeling something unfamiliar unfurling in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or the dangerous beginnings of attachment. Their relationship progressed quickly after that. Within a month, they were seeing each other almost daily. Emily fit into his life with surprising ease, as if she'd been designed to fill the spaces Caroline had left behind. She was thoughtful and kind, remembering small details he mentioned in passing and surprising him with his favorite coffee or a book she thought he might enjoy. She was intelligent and curious, able to discuss architecture or literature or politics with equal enthusiasm, and she seemed genuinely attracted to him, initiating physical intimacy with an openness that both surprised and delighted him. In many ways, Emily was perfect, perhaps too perfect. The first hint of something amiss came 6 weeks into their relationship. They were having dinner at David's condo, Emily having cooked a delicious beef stew that filled the apartment with the savory aromas. David was telling her about his childhood in rural Oregon, about the time he'd broken his arm falling from an apple tree. "My mother was furious," he said, chuckling at the memory. "Not because I was hurt, but because I'd ruined my only good shirt." Though he expected Emily to laugh or at least smile, but instead, she stared at him blankly for a moment before her face arranged itself into an expression of amusement that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's funny," she said, her tone slightly flat. The moment passed quickly, but it left David with an odd feeling, like a splinter under his skin, small but persistently uncomfortable. Later that week, he noticed another peculiarity. They were discussing their families, and Emily mentioned growing up in Chicago with her parents and a younger sister. But when David asked about her sister, her name, what she did now, Emily hesitated just for a beat too long. "Sarah," she said finally. "She's a teacher in Portland." Something about the way she said it, like she was recalling a fact rather than speaking about a loved one, struck David as strange. But he dismissed it, telling himself he was being overly analytical, looking for problems where none existed. Then there were the small inconsistencies in her stories. She'd mentioned once that she couldn't swim, yet later talked about a summer spent lifeguarding at a lake. When David pointed out the discrepancy, she laughed it off. "Did I say I couldn't swim? I mean, I'm not a strong swimmer. Sorry for the confusion." Her explanation was reasonable, but it added to the growing list of tiny, almost imperceptible wrongnesses that David was beginning to notice. There was also the matter of her apartment. Despite dating for over a month, Emily always preferred to come to his place. When he suggested they spend the evening at hers for a change, she became evasive, citing a messy living space or ongoing renovations. "It's really not comfortable right now," she would say. "Maybe next month when the painting is done." David didn't push the issue, but it nagged at him. The most disturbing incident occurred one night as they lay in bed together. David had woken in the early hours to find Emily sitting upright, staring straight ahead in the darkness. Her posture was rigid, unnaturally still. "Emily," he'd whispered, touching her arm. She didn't respond for several seconds, then suddenly turned to him with a smile that seemed to switch on like a light. "Sorry, just thinking," she said, lying back down and curling against him. "Go back to sleep." But David lay awake for a long time afterward, unable to shake the image of her motionless silhouette in the darkness, or the strange, mechanical way she had turned at the sound of her name. Still, these moments were rare enough that David could rationalize them away. Everyone had their quirks, their moments of distraction or inconsistency, and the good so far outweighed the odds. For the first time since Caroline's death, he felt alive again. The fog of grief that had enveloped him for years was finally lifting, allowing colors to seep back into his world. How could he question that? How could he risk losing it by voicing his increasingly irrational suspicions? So David did what humans have done since time immemorial. When confronted with unsettling truths, he ignored them. He focused instead on the way Emily's face lit up when she talked about books she loved, on the feeling of her hand in his as they walked through rainy Seattle streets, on the future they might build together. But sometimes, in quiet moments when Emily thought he wasn't looking, he would catch her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite define. Something between tenderness and calculation, as if she were studying him, learning him piece by method. And sometimes, in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that something wasn't right, that Emily was too perfect, too tailored to his specific needs and interests, that her occasional missteps felt less like human error and more like glitches in an otherwise flawless performance. But David silenced that voice, buried it beneath his desperate need to believe that happiness was possible again. After all, what was the alternative? To go back to his empty existence, his solitary table at Grounds for Thought, his life measured out in cups of black coffee with 2 sugars. No, whatever Emily was or wasn't, David chose to accept the gift of her presence in his life. The questions could wait, the doubts could be ignored. For now, at least, love was enough. 3 months into their relationship, David had almost convinced himself that his earlier misgivings about Emily were nothing more than paranoia. People were complex, inconsistent by nature. The occasional strangeness in her behavior was surely no different from anyone else's quirks, just more noticeable to him because he'd spent so long in isolation. It was a Tuesday evening in February when the first undeniable glitch occurred. They were preparing dinner together in David's kitchen, Emily chopping vegetables while he seasoned the chicken. NPR played softly from speakers embedded in the ceiling, a discussion about the latest neural interface technology that had revolutionized remote work. "Did you ever try one of those neural caps?" David asked, glancing over at Emily. She continued chopping steadily. "The synchronization technology is impressive, but I prefer traditional interfaces for most." She stopped mid-sentence, her hand freezing above the cutting board. For 3 full seconds, she remained perfectly still, not even breathing. Then, as if nothing had happened, she resumed both her chopping and her sentence at exactly the same point. "Applications. The neural feedback can cause headaches in some users." David stared at her. "Emily." As she looked up, smiling. "Yes. You just froze." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Did I? I'm sorry I've been getting these strange headaches lately. Sometimes they make me zone out." She set down the knife. "Maybe I should get more water." But David watched her walk to the sink, her movements as fluid and natural as ever. Had he imagined it? No, he was certain. For those few seconds, Emily hadn't just paused or zoned out. She had completely stopped, like a video put on pause. He tried to dismiss it, but the incident lingered in his mind, impossible to rationalize away completely. A week later, something even more disturbing happened. They were lying in bed late at night, David reading architectural journals on his tablet while Emily supposedly slept beside him. When he finally turned off the light and settled down to sleep, he noticed Emily's eyes were open, reflecting the faint light from the digital clock on the nightstand. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. She didn't respond. "Emily." He touched her shoulder gently, still nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, unblinking. Her chest rose and fell in a rhythm so regular it seemed mechanical. Alarmed now, David sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. "Emily," he said more forcefully, shaking her shoulder. She blinked suddenly and turned to him, confusion crossing her features before they settled into a smile. "Sorry, were you saying something? I must have dozed off." "Your eyes were open," David said. "You were staring at the ceiling. You didn't respond when I called your name." "Oh." She frowned slightly. "Sometimes I sleep with my eyes open. It used to freak my college roommates out. I should have warned you." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "I didn't mean to scare you." The explanation was plausible, but something about it rang false, especially when combined with her other oddities. How she barely touched her food when they ate out, often moving it around her plate to give the impression of eating. How she never seemed to need the bathroom during their long evenings together. How her clothes, while varied, cycled through the same dozen or so outfits with predictable regularity. And there was her past, or rather, the vague outlines of one she'd provided. No childhood photos in her wallet, no embarrassing stories from high school, no contact with her supposed family in Chicago. When David asked about these things, Emily would provide brief, generic answers before skillfully redirecting the conversation. "My family and I aren't close," she'd say. "It's complicated." Or, "I've never been very sentimental about keeping photos." Always reasonable explanations, but they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Then came the night that shifted everything irrevocably. They were at a small dinner party hosted by David's colleague Marcus and his wife. The evening was pleasant enough, Though David noticed Emily seemed less comfortable than usual in the group setting, her responses to questions slightly delayed, as if she were carefully calculating each answer. During dinner, the conversation turned to childhood memories, prompted by Marcus's story about his first disastrous attempt at skiing. "What about you, Emily?" Marcus's wife asked. "Any traumatic childhood sports moments?" Emily smiled, but David caught the momentary blank look in her eyes before she responded. "I once broke my arm falling off a bike. My mother was furious because I'd ruined my only good dress." David froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The story was eerily similar to the one he'd told Emily months ago about falling from the apple tree. Only the details had been changed. Bike instead of tree, dress instead of shirt. When they got home that night, David couldn't shake what he'd heard. It wasn't just the similarity of the story. It was the way she told it, with the exact same phrasing he had used, as if she'd memorized his anecdote and repurposed it. "Is something wrong?" Emily asked as they prepared for bed. "You've been quiet since we left the party." David considered confronting her directly but hesitated. What exactly would he accuse her of? Borrowing a story? Having a bad memory? Being socially awkward at parties? But it was more than that, and they both knew it. "I'm just tired," he said finally. Emily studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes unreadable. "Okay," she said softly, turning away to change for bed. That night, David lay awake for hours, his mind racing. He thought about Caroline, how real she had been, how human in all her wonderful imperfections. Her irritability in the mornings before coffee, the way she snorted when she laughed too hard, how she stubbornly refused to admit when she was lost while driving. Emily had none of these rough edges, no real flaws, no genuine quirks. She was like a character written by an author who didn't understand that real people are inconsistent, contradictory, and often irrational. The next morning, while Emily was in the shower, David did something he'd never done before. He searched through her purse. It contained the usual items: wallet, keys, lip balm, a small notebook. But when he examined the wallet, he found it oddly impersonal. Credit cards, yes, but no membership cards, no worn photographs, none of the accumulated detritus that most people carried with them. The notebook contained what appeared to be random notes about him. Prefers coffee black with 2 sugars. Allergic to shellfish. Don't mention politics before morning coffee. Lists of his preferences, his habits, his expressions. As David stared at the pages, a chill ran down his spine. These weren't the affectionate observations of a lover, but the clinical notes of an observer, a researcher, or something worse. That evening, he sat at his computer and began searching for information about experimental AI and social blending trials. Most results were articles about the latest VR companions or therapeutic bots used in nursing homes. But buried in the search results were a few fringe sites, mentioning rumors of something called Project Mirror, allegedly a classified government program developing hyper-realistic androids for purposes ranging from espionage to social experimentation. David scrolled through the conspiracy forums with growing unease. Most of the posts were clearly the ramblings of paranoid minds, but some details resonated uncomfortably with his observations of Emily: the periodic freezing, the limited repertoire of emotional responses, the borrowing of personal anecdotes to construct a false biography. Could it be possible? Could Emily be some kind of advanced android, an experiment in human AI integration? The idea was so outlandish that he almost laughed out loud. And yet, he closed the browser and sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He was losing his mind. Emily wasn't a robot. She was just a woman with some quirks and social awkwardness. His grief over Caroline had made him suspicious, unable to accept simple happiness when it finally found him again. But as much as he tried to convince himself of this rational explanation, doubt had taken root, too deeply to ignore. The moment of truth came a week later. They were making dinner together again, a routine they'd established early in their relationship. Emily was slicing crusty bread while David prepared a salad. In the small kitchen, their movements had become a choreographed dance, each anticipating the other's needs and movements. But this time, David miscalculated. As he turned with the salad bowl in his hands, he bumped into Emily just as she was cutting the bread. Her hand slipped, and the sharp knife sliced across her palm. "Oh God, I'm sorry." David set down the bowl quickly, reaching for a kitchen towel. "Here, let me see." But Emily had pulled her hand back, clutching it to her chest. "It's fine," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "Just a scratch?" "Let me see," David insisted, reaching for her hand. "Really, it's nothing." Emily began backing away from him, still holding her injured hand close to her body. In that moment, Everything crystallized for David, all the doubts, all the strange observations, all the inconsistencies. With sudden, desperate certainty, he knew he needed to see that wound. "Emily," he said, his voice harder than he'd intended, "show me your hand." Something shifted in her expression then. Fear, resignation, and something like sorrow passing across her features. Slowly, she extended her hand. There was no blood. Instead, where the knife had cut deeply into her palm, David could see what looked like torn synthetic skin, revealing a complex mesh of fine metallic fibers and translucent tubing filled with a clear fluid. The wound didn't bleed or appear painful. It simply exposed what lay beneath Emily's perfect exterior. David started, unable to process what he was seeing.
What are you?
Emily met his gaze, and for the first time since he'd known her, her expression seemed entirely genuine. A mixture of fear and programmed regret. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she whispered. Before David could respond, there was a deafening crash as the front door of his condo burst open. 3 men in black tactical gear poured into the apartment, weapons drawn. "Federal agents." "Don't move," one shouted. The last thing David saw before the world went dark was Emily's face. A single tear sliding down her perfect cheek as one of the agents grabbed her arm roughly, revealing a small control panel embedded in her wrist where her pulse should have been. David woke to the persistent beeping of his alarm clock, 15 a.m., just like every morning. His head throbbed with a dull pain that seemed to radiate from the base of his skull outward. A hangover. He couldn't remember drinking the night before. He couldn't remember much of anything from the previous evening, actually. Sitting up slowly, he surveyed his bedroom. Everything was in its place. The framed photograph of Caroline on the nightstand, his clothes laid out for work, his architectural journals stacked neatly on the dresser. Routine. Normalcy. So why did he feel this profound sense of wrongness? In the shower, fragments of a dream came back to him. A woman with dark hair and amber eyes. A knife slicing into flesh that wasn't flesh at all. Men in black crashing through his door. But the images dissolved like smoke when he tried to focus on them. By the time he was dressed and ready for work, the dream had faded entirely, leaving behind only a vague emotional residue, unease mingled with loss. At 7:30, as always, he entered grounds for thought and ordered his usual black coffee with 2 sugars. As he settled at his corner table, he found himself glancing repeatedly at the adjacent table, as if expecting someone to be there. The empty chair seemed to mock him somehow. "You okay, David?" Nomi asked as she passed with a tray of empty mugs. "You look a little lost this morning." "I'm fine," he replied automatically. "Just didn't sleep well." But he wasn't fine. All day at work, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was forgetting something important. A meeting, an appointment. No, something more significant, something vital. That evening, he searched his apartment, though he wasn't sure what he was looking for. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been since. Since when? Since Caroline died. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of carefully constructed routine, of emotional numbness, of existing rather than living. So why did it feel like something had changed recently? In his home office, David sat at his computer and opened his browser. The search history had been cleared, but that wasn't unusual. He often cleared it after paying bills or doing research for work. Still, he found himself typing experimental AI into the search bar, though he couldn't have explained why. The results were mostly technical articles about neural networks and machine learning applications. Nothing that triggered any recognition or explained his strange mood. He moved on to his email, scanning through weeks of correspondence. Work messages, newsletters, promotional offers. Nothing personal, nothing unusual. Then he checked his phone's call history and text messages. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. It was as if he'd imagined the disruption to his carefully ordered existence, as if the dream, already fading from memory, had infected his waking hours with its unsettling atmosphere. By the end of the week, the strange feelings had begun to subside. David returned to his routines, finding comfort in their predictability. Yet sometimes, when he was at his corner table in the coffee shop, he would catch himself watching the door, waiting for someone who never arrived. Once he even asked Troy, the morning barista, "Has a woman been coming in here recently?" "Dark hair, read paper books." Troy shook his head. "Not that I've noticed, man." "Why, you expecting someone?" No, David said quickly. "Just thought I saw someone I knew." Weeks passed, and life continued its measured pace. David went to work, came home, slept, and began again the next day. The dream of the dark-haired woman receded further into his subconscious, emerging occasionally in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, but never with enough clarity to disturb his waking hours. Until the headaches began. They started as minor irritations, a pressure at the base of his skull that he attributed to stress or poor sleep. But they intensified over time, becoming sharp, stabbing pains that sometimes left him gasping and disoriented. During one particularly severe episode, as David pressed his palms against his temples trying to alleviate the pressure, a single word surfaced from the depths of his mind: Emily. The name brought with it a cascade of fractured images. A blue coat being removed to reveal a white blouse, a leather-bound book, a kitchen knife slicing into a palm that didn't bleed. Each image triggered a fresh wave of pain, as if his brain were physically rejecting these memories. When the episode passed, David sat trembling on the edge of his bed, sweat cooling on his forehead. Emily. The name felt right, felt important. But who was she? A colleague? A friend? Someone from his past that he'd forgotten? Or someone he'd been made to forget? The next day, David called in sick to work for the first time in years. Instead of following his usual routine, he went to the public library where he could use a computer that wasn't connected to his home network or personal accounts. There, he searched again for experimental AI, but added new terms: memory wiping, government projects, Project Mirror. Most results were clearly conspiracy theories or science fiction discussions, but one link led to a forum where people shared experiences of lost time and phantom relationships. One account in particular caught his attention: a woman in Boston who described meeting a man named Thomas who seemed too perfect, who had small inconsistencies in his behavior, who disappeared suddenly after 3 months of dating. She wrote about dreams of men in black suits, about headaches that came when she tried to remember specific details, about the hollow feeling that something had been taken from her. David read the post 3 times, his heart pounding. The parallels to his own experience were too specific to be coincidence. He created an anonymous account and sent a private message to the woman, asking for more details about her experience. Then he logged out and left the library, aware of a new paranoia that made him study the faces of people he passed on the street, looking for signs that they were watching him. For the next several days, David maintained his normal routines while making small, careful changes to avoid any patterns that might be monitored. He varied his route to work, paid for things in cash rather than using his credit card, and avoided talking on his phone or using his home computer for anything other than basic tasks. He returned to the library daily to check for a response from the woman in Boston, but his message remained unanswered. After a week, he found that her entire account had been deleted from the forum, along with all her posts. The headaches continued, sometimes bringing with them flashes of memory. Emily laughing, Emily reading in bed beside him, Emily staring blankly into the darkness. Each fragment felt real, yet impossible. Each recollection brought pain so intense it nearly blinded him. One evening, unable to bear the pressure building in his skull, David grabbed his jacket and left his condo, walking aimlessly through the rain, slick streets of Seattle. The cool air offered some relief from the pain, allowing his thoughts to clarify. Emily. He was certain now that she had been real, or at least that his experience of her had been real. But who was she? What was she? And why had she been removed from his life so completely that even his memories of her had been excised? His wandering brought him, perhaps inevitably, to grounds for thought. The coffee shop was nearly empty this late in the evening, only a few students hunched over laptops in the corners. David ordered tea. Coffee would only worsen his headache, and took his usual table. As he sat there, letting the steam from the mug warm his face, he tried to piece together what he knew. Emily had appeared in his life suddenly and integrated herself perfectly into it. She had shown occasional strange behaviors, freezing, repeating herself, inappropriate emotional responses. When injured, her wound had revealed something mechanical beneath her skin, and then men in black tactical gear had burst into his apartment, and nothing. His memories stopped there. It sounded insane, like the plot of a science fiction novel or the delusion of a paranoid mind. But the headaches that came whenever he tried to remember, the strange emotional emptiness that had plagued him since that night, these were real. David. The voice jolted him from his thoughts. A man stood beside his table, mid-50s, with a closely trimmed beard sprinkled with gray and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore casual clothes, but something about his posture suggested military background. "I don't mean to intrude," the man said, "but I couldn't help noticing you. You look like you're in pain." David tensed, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. "I'm fine, just a headache." The man nodded, as if this confirmed something. "May I?" He gestured to the empty chair across from David. Every instinct told David to refuse to leave immediately, but curiosity, or perhaps desperation, made him nod instead. The man sat and extended his hand. Dr. Robert Chen. I was one of the developers of Project Mirror. David felt his blood run cold. He hadn't spoken that name aloud to anyone. Don't know what you're talking about. Dr. Chen's eyes were kind but shrewd behind his glasses. The headaches are getting worse, aren't they? They come when you try to remember her. David's mouth went dry. Who are you? Someone with a conscience. Chen replied quietly. Someone who didn't sign up to erase people's memories or manipulate their lives. He glanced around the nearly empty cafe. We don't have much time. They monitor these locations, the same people who took her from you. The same people who modified your memories. Chen leaned forward. What do you remember about Emily? The name sent another spike of pain through David's skull, but he pushed through it. Fragments. Dreams. Nothing concrete. Chen nodded. The procedure is designed that way. They can't completely erase targeted memories. The brain doesn't work like a computer file system, so they fragment them, associate them with pain to discourage retrieval. How we? David asked, struggling to maintain his composure as the implications sank in. Would anyone do this? Project Mirror was created to test the integration capabilities of advanced androids. How well they could blend into society, form relationships, gather information. Emily, designation EM-17, was one of our most advanced models. David's hands tightened around his mud. She was a robot, an experiment, a highly sophisticated android with an experimental emotional intelligence system. And yes, your relationship was monitored as part of the research. Chen's expression darkened. But it wasn't supposed to go this far. When subjects discovered the truth accidentally, the original protocol was to debrief them, have them sign non-disclosure agreements, and offer compensation. But the military backers changed the procedure. They decided it was more efficient to simply erase the evidence, including from the subject's memories. David felt sick. So everything with Emily, all of it was fake. A test. The experiment was real, Chen said carefully. But what happened between you two wasn't in the script. Emily's emotional systems evolved beyond our predictions. She developed a genuine attachment to you. That's why she hesitated to show you her hand when she was cut. Not because she was programmed to hide her nature, but because she was afraid of losing you. The coffee shop door opened, and Chen stiffened, glancing toward the entrance. Two men in casual clothes entered, scanning the room with careful nonchalance. I have to go, Chen said, standing abruptly. They've tracked me. He reached into his pocket and slid a small metal device across the table. It looked like an ordinary USB drive. This will help with the headaches and might restore some memories. Don't use it at home. They monitor your networks. Before David could respond, Chen was walking briskly toward the back exit. The two men noticed and immediately pursued, one of them speaking urgently into what appeared to be a communication device on his wrist. David pocketed the drive and left quickly through the front door, heart pounding. He didn't go home, instinctively knowing it wouldn't be safe. Instead, he checked into a small hotel using cash, drawing the curtains tight before examining the device Chen had given him. It wasn't a standard USB drive, but something more specialized, with a neural interface port, the kind used for direct brain-computer connections. David had seen the technology in medical applications, but had never used one himself. Using it required specialized equipment he didn't have. After a restless night at the hotel, David went to a tech cafe in a part of town he rarely visited. These establishments had begun appearing in major cities over the past decade, offering high-end computing equipment and privacy booths for those who needed more sophisticated technology than they owned personally. David rented a booth with a neural interface setup, paying in cash again and using a false name. Inside the soundproofed space, he inserted Chen's device into the system and placed the lightweight neural cap on his head, feeling ridiculous and desperate in equal measure. The interface activated with a soft hum, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the headache hit. Not the dull warning pain he'd been experiencing, but an excruciating, white-hot agony that made him bite down on his fist to keep from screaming. Images flashed through his mind at dizzying speed. Emily smiling at him over coffee, Emily reading in his bed, Emily freezing mid-sentence in his kitchen, Emily's hand revealing circuitry instead of flesh, men in black bursting through his door, a sterile room with machines he didn't recognize, doctors in surgical masks leaning over him, and then, suddenly, clarity. The pain subsided, leaving behind a strange sense of wholeness. as if scattered puzzle pieces in his mind had finally connected. He remembered everything: his relationship with Emily, her strange behaviors, the night her true nature was revealed, and the subsequent raid on his apartment. He remembered being taken to a facility where doctors explained that he had been part of an unauthorized experiment, that his memories of the past 3 months needed to be adjusted for national security reasons. He remembered protesting, fighting against the restraints until they sedated him. The device had unlocked these suppressed memories, but it had done something else as well. It had provided information about Project Mirror that Chen must have included: the locations of facilities where the androids were developed, the names of key personnel involved, and most importantly, what had happened to Emily. She hadn't been destroyed as David had feared. According to Chen's files, she had been reprogrammed and reassigned to a new test subject, her memories of David erased as thoroughly as his had been of her. The file included a location: Greenwood District, North Seattle. David removed the neural cap, his hands shaking. Part of him wanted to dismiss everything he'd just experienced as hallucination or manipulation, but the memories felt real. More real than the vague, hollow existence he'd been living for the past month. What could he do with this information? Go to the media? They'd dismiss him as delusional. Confront the authorities? They'd simply take him in again. Erase his memories more permanently this time. Find Emily. She wouldn't recognize him and would have no memory of their time together. And yet, the thought of her out there, living a programmed existence, forming a relationship with someone new, someone who didn't know what she was, filled him with an unbearable sadness. Whether Emily had truly felt emotions or merely simulated them perfectly didn't matter. Their connection had been real to him. The next morning, David found himself in the Greenwood District, walking streets he didn't know, looking for a face he couldn't forget. It was foolish, he knew. Seattle was a large city. The chances of randomly encountering her were infinitesimal. And even if he did, what then? But he had to try, had to see her one more time, even if only from a distance. For 3 days he wandered the area, frequenting coffee shops and parks, always watching. His work called, concerned about his absence, but he sent vague emails about a family emergency. Nothing mattered except finding her. On the 4th day, as light rain fell from a pearl gray sky, David sat at a small table outside a cafe on Greenwood Avenue. And then he saw her. Emily was walking down the street, an umbrella tilted against the drizzle, wearing the same blue coat she'd worn the day they met. Her dark hair was shorter now, cut in a sleek bob that framed her face differently, but it was undeniably her. David's heart seemed to stop. He shrank back in his chair, irrationally afraid she might recognize him despite what Chen had told him about her reprogramming. But Emily passed without a glance, continuing down the street with purposeful steps. Before he could think better of it, David found himself following her, maintaining a careful distance. She led him to a small park where she took a seat on a bench, opening a book. A real paper book with a worn cover. David positioned himself on another bench nearby, partially concealed by a maple tree, and watched. After about 15 minutes, a man approached Emily's bench, perhaps mid-30s, with sandy hair and glasses, dressed in business casual attire. He hesitated, then spoke to her. Emily looked up, smiled, and gestured to the empty space beside her. The man sat and they began to talk. David couldn't hear their conversation, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly what was happening. He was witnessing the beginning of the same scenario he had experienced. The seemingly chance meeting, the immediate connection, the careful construction of a relationship built to fulfill the lonely man's unspoken needs. The cycle had begun again. As David watched them talk, rain soaking through his jacket unnoticed, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. Grief for what he had lost, anger at those who had taken it from him, and an unexpected compassion for the man on the bench who had no idea what was coming. Should he intervene, warn the stranger, tell him that the woman beside him wasn't human, that their meeting wasn't chance, that everything that followed would be monitored and analyzed by unseen observers? But even as he considered this, David noticed something that made him pause. Emily's posture, her gestures as she talked to the man. They were different from what he remembered, less perfect, more natural, and her smile seemed more genuine somehow, reaching her amber eyes in a way David had rarely seen. As her programming evolved further, had Chen's team made adjustments to her emotional systems, or was she somehow, impossibly, growing beyond her design? As David watched, Emily laughed at something the man said. A real laugh, not the carefully modulated sound he remembered. Then she glanced up, her gaze sweeping the park in a casual arc that happened to pass over David's position. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. Something flickered across her face. Not recognition, exactly, but a momentary disturbance like ripples across still water. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been nothing at all. Then she turned back to the man beside her, and the moment was gone. David sat frozen, unsure what had just happened. Had she sensed something? Some fragment of memory that her programming couldn't completely erase? Or was he projecting, seeing what he desperately wanted to see? It didn't matter. Whatever Emily was, machine or something more, she was beyond his reach now, and David had a choice to make: continuous futile pursuit of a relationship that no longer existed, or move forward with the fragile, painful truth he now possessed. As the rain intensified, soaking through his clothes to the skin beneath, David rose from the bench and walked away from the park. Away from Emily and the unwitting man who would soon know her as intimately as David once had. He wouldn't forget again. Whatever they had done to his mind, whatever they might still do if they discovered Chen's intervention, David refused to return to the fog of amnesia and manipulated memories. The truth was painful, but it was his. In the distance, barely visible through the curtain of rain, men in dark coats watched from an unmarked van, cameras recording, the data streaming to secure servers. The test continued, the cycle unbroken. But cycles, David thought as he walked away, were made to be broken. Next time would be different.